Hello world. Patricia O'Connor and Frida Reba Dorsey here today on the bonsai balcony. My little clogs next to the door. Today on the bonsai balcony, let's talk about the age of trees. The age of trees. Sometimes, like when you're looking at something, it'll say how old it is, and we think, oh my God, that's so old. And kind of the to some extent, maybe the worth of a tree is tied to its age. Is that superficial? Is that a superficial thing to be hung up about? Yeah, I don't think so. Not really. Not really, because at the end of the day, how we take care of trees might depend on what their age is. Their health and vigor might also be attached to their age, but we tend to think that older trees are like, it's like this thing is 1,000,000 years old. There are websites out there that are dedicated to the 5 oldest bonsai, and okay, I'm looking at this oak. This we'll say this California oak here. It's barked over nicely. That's indicative of age. I don't know exactly what your oaks bark over, but this oak tree had been grown by mostly one person for most of its life, and we did have a pretty good idea of its age, and it was said to be 40 years old. That seems to be very well believable. The person who grew it was certainly in the nursery business longer than that. And another thing is it doesn't produce acorns, which I believe with oaks happens at about 50 years. So that would, so we'll just look at that and check the box. Checks out. Now, what if I'd bought the tree under the impression that it was a 65, 75-year-old, 100-year-old tree? That's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, on one hand, if I really wanted it to be that old, there's probably not a lot of difference in the care between one year that I mentioned and another. So that's just mainly superficial. Maybe you will have paid more for it. But on the other hand, it's not totally. I got a broken limb here, and oaks tend not to repair for broken limbs. But if you think about it, it's not just superficial. The years it will have been grown, or the years that someone will have been giving that tree bonsai care, and that's not worthless. That does have a worth. That does have a, so saying something is 100 years old or something would very much not just be bragging rights about something being old, but also how long knowledgeable people, and that's something else you would look at the tree and say, this has been very well manicured for a long time to look this way, or this tree has had its ups and downs or whatever. And all of those things combined. But just to base the worth of a tree based on its years and its years alone can get a little deceptive. Some of us age more quickly than others. Some of us age really quickly, looking at you, bald cypress, and some of us age pretty slowly. They grow pretty slowly, looking at you, O Ponderosa. The growing season for this guy in its natural environment was about 4 years. So its amount of yearly growth would be minimal compared to these guys. And sometimes in their most loved environments, they probably can grow a good number of feet. Not probably, do quite often grow sometimes tens of feet in a year. Plant one of these out in a low-lying area where it gets watered, where where a little drainage area or something, or where roof lines come together, and make sure it gets watered real well, and see what happens to that. It will, just shoot off there, and you'll see leaders just take off and gain 10, 15 feet every summer. So that's a fast growing tree. I've also seen people look at a tree like this and guesstimate that it is hundreds of years old. That would not be true. In this case, that would not be true. I've done the trunk chop on the center tree. I cut a wedge out of there, which led to those 2 leaders. And then, having removed the wedge out of the center, it gave me a great opportunity to buff the blunt end of that where it had been cut flat before, and I could clearly count the rings, how many were there. And that was 2 or 3 years ago, and they were less than 20. It was about 16 years old, so it's probably, the center tree is probably a 18, 19-year-old bald cypress, and a little scale, right? That's probably, all right, that's about a foot across. There's more, this fans out more out to here if I had it uncovered. Those 3 would be uncovered at different rates. When I rake them back, I'm gonna have to raise some and lower some when I replant them for keeps. So, yeah, anyway, that tree is a little wider than it looks, is what that means. So the tree is not as old as some people would say. If somebody were to put that tree on auction and somebody said, how old is it? And they would say, oh, that's probably, look at that buttress, and that's probably a 50, 75 year old. Not so. That tree is less than 20 years old. They just grow. They grow really fast. In the 3 years that I've had these tops that are 2 and 3 feet long have been chopped back numerous times. Every one of these guys has been sawed in half, probably no more than 4 or 5 times each. So that gives you some idea. And here the temperatures are a little temperate, a little too easy going. They would probably like the heat to be turned up a little, get a little bit more tropical. But our rites of passage, we're looking at things on here. They bark up fairly early. These trees also do look adult quickly, fairly quickly. You don't have to wait tens of years to see them starting to make bark. I would say the ones on either side of it are probably much, much less in age than the one in the center. Now, having said that, we can move on to some pine trees. We'll just look at this. This is our cork bark oak. It's known to go super bonkers when it comes to the bark, and that really helps us. But also, as mentioned earlier, when I purchased this tree, having been told it was a 35-year-old, I think, air layer, and I really love my oak, but cork bark oak. But what goes along with that is there are no acorns to this tree either, and which would say that it's less than 50 years old. But I would say the amount of growth we have, I haven't counted the rings on this, so I can't say for sure. But here's something else. If I bought this tree under the assumption that this was a 75-year-old bonsai tree, and I paid a couple of $1,000s for it because it was in this shape and not fully ramified, this is not a couple of $1,000. This would still be probably, in that unramified shape and just a standard pot. This would probably be a $1,200 or $1,500, pre-bonsai, right? But if I got it home and then discovered that because it didn't make acorns, that means that it couldn't possibly be 75 years old, or even air layered from a tree that was 75 years old, if I were hugely disappointed, then that would, to my way of thinking, that's almost be what I would get for worrying about all the wrong things. Kind of, because when it comes time to reach in and take acceptance for a tree, and whatever you have to do to make that happen, allocate space to it, allocate time to it, allocate money towards its procurement. Whatever you have to do, that should be, to my way of thinking, based on the tree before you. If I thought this were if I were told this were a 100-year-old tree, and I found out it was a 25-year-old tree, if that really made me just want to unload it, then maybe I'm kind of worried about the wrong stuff. However, it does matter how I take care of a tree. If I think this is a 100-year-old tree and it's a 20-year-old tree, the method, because I've just panned over to a Japanese black pine, I should take care of a Japanese black pine that's elderly, say 50 years, 40 years or older. I should take that more on a year-by-year basis whenever it comes to decandling and stuff. There is a rule of thumb that goes that you slow down in the doing of certain things when it comes to certain trees being elderly. This is a 75-year-old Japanese black pine. I believe it to be a 75-year-old Japanese black pine because it's at least that old. What I do know is that I am the third owner. I'm the third owner of this tree, so we do have people who have been keeping track of how long they've had it, and as they passed it along to someone else, they passed it along that info. And there are things about black pines that we can tell that we know that would line up with this info. I should have probably rotated this tree around so we weren't looking at the back of it, with the front of it. I could show off that trunk and that cork bark and stuff. But and I'm going to get this wrong because I haven't even thought about this in over a year, but at 10 years, a Japanese black pine will begin to make bark on the trunk. At 10 to 20 years, that bark will encompass the entire trunk. At 20 to 30 years, that bark starts at the branches, and at the other end of that, it exceeds down to the end of the branches. And that's kind of, that little rule of thumb is a way that somebody can look at a Japanese black pine and tell how long it's been going by what if anything has bark on it, and where that bark has grown. And that'll pretty much back up or pitch out somebody's estimation on how long a tree. Sometimes people will show you small trees that have been real carefully worked on for 4 or 5 years, and maybe the other person who comes along and works in that greenhouse will tell you if those trees are 30 years old. But if they don't have bark on them, that's probably not. It's probably not necessarily a lie. That's probably, that's just like the person who looked at bald cypresses and would have thought them to be 50, 75-year-old trees. They probably weren't being deliberate. Who knows? They might have just been figurative. That could easily pass. We do that as human beings. Some of us could easily pass for older. Some of us could easily pass for younger. And at the end of the day, some of that is superficial, except that bonsai, what we typically want trees with substance and trees that replicate or give the illusion or the perception of age or time having passed. And sometimes it's we get a little hung up in like a little collision of ideas. you see a little sprout come up, and it just looks so beautiful and vibrant in its youth. And you know, the little stem comes up and a branch comes out and a branch comes out and the stem comes further, boom, boom. And that was just perfectly symmetrical. Year two, it's growing somewhere, it's getting all the light, it's getting all the sun, it's getting enough water, and it's not growing too tall, but its roots are growing a couple of feet in the ground and they're still getting oxygen, and that thing just looks so vibrant and healthy. And it's, you know what else it is? It's so symmetrical. It's that symmetry says, hey world, I'm here to take names. I am the future, and I am, you know, and I am green. And time has a way of changing those things. We lose a leader sometimes and have to make different plans, or we suffer a dry spell and our top dies back. So we start a new leader the next spring when buds come out. And that is what leads to asymmetry, the lack of symmetry. The lack of symmetry is what denotes age. Those jagged pieces, those sharis, those deadwood features. So while on one hand we do admire that, and that is something to be achieved, bonsais are made, not grown. You know, a lot of those deadwood features on Japanese black pines you see didn't get that way by themselves. They had to be made that way, or whether they were made to look like they weren't made that way, that depends on who did it and how well they are. I'm learning about that. I'm learning not to put tools to stuff as much as I can help it. Meanwhile, they're still doing lots of work here around the apartment. But that's our little ins and outs about age. There are ways to tell how old something is. You could take any particular species of tree and probably Google things that will tell you how old, but I already, just like I mentioned there, this guy is not making acorns. This guy is not making acorns. That means that they are both less than 50 years of age, but they are both at an age where they have been producing bark for several years. And most of the branches on all those guys that have any time to them at all are barked over. And then, like we said about our pines, there are the different stages of those. Cypress trees sort of renew constantly. So I don't know that branches look a certain way when they're older or not. In fact, from what I've seen, they tend to make what looks like cane poles from the top to bottom of the tree, and it swaps those out frequently. I've sat on the front porch of my house that the family had at a farm that had quite a few cypress trees, and in the still of the evening you could hear a loud pop, and if you looked in the right direction at the right time, you would see a branch not falling down like it had like partially broken and it hung there and just decided to give up. It was falling straight down like it had just grown just enough and gotten just fat enough that it squeezed itself too tightly between the rows of bark that were, and it goes pop, and then you would see it fall straight down. And I've also driven the tractor underneath those trees and mowing, and before I realized what was going on, I would pick up these limbs and go, these things look like they were cut. Who's been on our land? And that was me being paranoid, and I was. They just pop like carrots. They snap like carrots. And when the bark rolls over enough to make them do that, they go pop. So that's something I'm thinking whenever it comes time to these. On one hand, to have big, heavy, thick branches on here denotes age and time. But I've also seen some bald cypress trees that branches that are 10 years old start to get a little too thick to be believable. And I think whenever I have these at a stopping point, they'll never quite always be at a stopping point. I will always probably have to have new branches coming along in the wings, not messing up the looks necessarily. That depends on how I do it. But yeah, I think I will have to grow those always with replacement branches at some point. So that's just a little bit about trees and the years of trees. By that, we can look at that and say our our literati, Japanese black pine, is between is about 10 years old. Look, see, we've got bark, but it stops. By here is no bark. So I would say this guy is about a 10-year-old tree, going on a 10-year-old tree. That guy, I got it when it was 75. It's going on 80. This guy, I got it at 17 years from seed, and it shows all those same telltales that would lead us to believe that it's knocking on 20 years now. So that's kind of how. If somebody has given you the history of something, which is always cool, if you have an antique or something, to have the history with it sort of ups the value. That's a known thing that a history, and especially a good story, sometimes can really, add to the grandeur of something. But at the end of the day, some of that it can be a little deceiving, and I wouldn't necessarily get totally hung up on buying a tree based on the fact that it's a case in point. You can find 400-year-old trees out there that are olives, and you can find them very cheaply. Somebody will go up to a huge cut olive and literally just knock chunks off of it and sprout them, and then sell those chunks of sprouted wood with little wired sprouts on them that are 2 months old, as a 400-year-old bonsai. And that's technically well, first of all, it's still pre-bonsai, but yeah. So that's a clear example of, if you just want to get caught up in years, you could easily spend real money for some chunk of wood that somebody sprouted that is on a tree that's 400 years old, that then goes under the billing of a 400-year-old tree. So that, balance. But that's still useful. The age of it is still useful information in a lot of other ways as to the care and upkeep and stuff like that. While we're talking, I am concerned. I'm concerned about Simply Pete. We were losing color, and I've moved it to a position where it will definitely photosynthesize if it's going to. But I have noticed a bad change of direction since our heat spell, and I've been keeping an eye on it. I tried to move it back out of direct light, and it's declined as such, and I'm going, well, it's been out of direct light as long enough to where it should have been getting enough to not be yellow, but we'll put it back in the sunlight. And we let it go dry, and then watered it thoroughly. So it's still uptaking water, but I'm not too hopeful at this point. It doesn't really look good for Sweet Pea. I think the heat spell may have gotten us. But not me, and not Frida. Not our little ponderosas. And, that's just the way it goes. To grow bonsai is to occasionally lose bonsai. Like and subscribe if you guys have not already. We will do another spot here before this weekend is out, either today or tonight, depending on whether or not I get past some internet snafus. I may have to do a test shot here in a minute to see whether or not live works. I appreciate you. Pumpkin here appreciates you. And thank you so much for watching.